Welcome to a walk in the garden. I'm Liz Davey, and we're going to walk around my garden today. It's a lovely, a little brisk fall day in mid to late September. And we're starting again in my herb garden for this episode. And it's time to start thinking about fall. Looking at the weather forecast, the temperatures at night are into the 40s, sometimes even into the upper 30s. It won't be long until the weatherman tells us there's a frost warning tonight. Our first frosts are probably light ones, which aren't killing frosts, but nonetheless, some of the tender things need to come inside, and it's time to start bringing them in now or getting them ready. In the herb garden, there are a number of things that you can pot up for fall, and I'm going to pot up a rosemary plant. Sometimes I have good luck keeping this inside. I'm going to try it this year on an unheated porch, and basically I want to get as many of its roots as I possibly can. There we go, we got a pretty good root ball there. And we'll put it into the pot at the same level. Use some of the soil from this potting hole. And then I'll be sure to water it well and put it in the shade for a few days until it takes hold. In fact, this is the season of getting things ready, and they'll be ready to bring in. We'll do more of that with some of the others. Other things that you could bring in would include the scented geraniums. They will be gone after the first frost, first killing frost at least. But we took cuttings of those a couple weeks ago, and the cuttings are growing well, and so I'm going to just leave these in the garden. The garden is very dry. The herb garden has not had any additional water. I heard on the news that I think we're about 8 inches of water behind for the season. That's really dry. I don't do a lot of outside watering. I water my vegetables, but as far as the herb garden goes, it's pretty much on its own, and it is dry. Most of the mints look very dry. Some of the things are even starting to get to the point that we can cut them back. Cutting back is something I do at the point where things start to go brown, and after a first light frost is a good time. The herb garden, actually, if you don't cut it back, it'll be just fine, and there are certain things in the herb garden that you don't want to cut back in the fall. That would be the things that are kind of semi-evergreen. This is southern wood. Lavender is another one that you leave. You don't cut that one back. Rue, another one that stays until spring, and then if it needs cutting back, you can cut it back then. Tansy is another one I leave. And the thymes, I don't cut those back either. This is another type of southern wood. Other things can be cut back. Oh, sage doesn't get cut back either. But you can pull up the scented geraniums once they're gone, and any annual herbs that you've put in. I have perilla in here as an annual, and several others. The lemon verbena is an annual, and that too will get pulled, unless I pot it up and try to bring it in for a little while. It tends to be a little finicky inside. Again, I did take some cuttings of it. If the cuttings don't root really well, I'll probably end up trying to save at least one plant for a little while so that I can still use its lovely lemon-scented leaves. Thymes are also all left without cutting back. So really cutting back is minimal. I will cut back oreganos. I will cut back the tarragon and some of the others. I'll leave the roses until spring. I have several roses in here. I haven't been real pleased with my herb garden this year. The dryness hasn't helped, of course, but I think things could grow a little better. So I've decided I'd like to have a soil test done on it. So I looked up UMass Extension online, just Google UMass Extension, and find the area for soil testing. They will give you all the directions you need to do a soil test, and the form for doing so is online, and you can fill that out. with the information, send in your sample and $10 and have a soil test. Now, how do you get the sample? They tell you how to do it, but I've started doing it already here. I'm getting it ready. And you want to dig down 6 or 8 inches, and since I took the plant out, this is a good opportunity. I've done some other spots, and we're going to go to 6 or 8 different spots in this garden, taking samples of the soil, and then we're going to mix those all together. And we're going to take it out to the garden shed. I'm going to remove the rocks, put those back in the garden, but I'm going to take this out to the garden shed and we'll let it dry for about a week. It's already pretty dry, so it's not going to take very long to completely dry out. And then we'll pack it, and we'll take that out to the garden shed a little later. Now let's move over to the perennial gardens. I'm in the perennial garden. It too is quite dry, and we will start thinking about cutting back things here as they turn brown. I have some lilies back here that can be cut off now because they are brown, and they're not adding much to the garden at this point. So we'll just be cutting those down and composting them. Anything that showed a lot of signs of disease, put into a garbage bag and dispose of it that way rather than cutting it back. As you cut things back that are spent, and there's a bloom, you can remove the supports that were around the plants and put those away. There are a number of supports around things. They've been hidden most of the season, but now that they're starting to show, I just stack them up and put them back by my potting table for the winter. This plant is Boltonia. It looks like a fall aster. It's actually a Boltonia. It comes in white and pink. It's a pretty upright plant for the most part. Doesn't need a whole lot of support, but it does add some nice white to the garden, or pink if you have the pink variety. The pink variety is a little bit shorter. Again, Boltonia. This one is a Eupatorium, and this is chocolate. It has a nice dark foliage throughout the season, and its white blooms are just starting to be apparent. I'll be leaving a number of things like the spent blooms of the echinacea because the birds just love the seeds. And we'll leave some of those for the birds for a while until everything turns brown, and then they can be cut back. I'm going to move along here a little bit. These are fall asters, and this is a purple dome aster. This is actually the pink dome. I have purple dome, and this one's a little pinker and that one's a little more purple. We'll get over to that one in a few minutes. These are the pink dome. The black-eyed Susans, again, are gone, and I'll leave the seed heads. Chickadees absolutely love them. As we start to cut things back, you'll notice that some of the things that we cut back form basal growth, and we can pull this out on this salvia and cut some of the spent stalks off now. A few of them are still growing and green, but the ones that are brown I will cut off. You'll notice some of the plants, and Shasta daisies are one of those plants. The salvias, some of the other plants will have what's called a basal set of foliage down at the bottom. And that's still nice and green, and that will stay pretty much all winter. So you don't cut that back. When you're cutting these down, you cut down to that basal foliage, but not beyond it. Other plants will not have any basal foliage at all, and when they turn brown, you can take them all the way to the ground. I always leave the iris, and again, wait until it turns brown to remove the stems. We have some light color here provided by annuals that I put in. I put these in, and the heliotrope, which is a tender annual, that one will succumb to frost, as will the zinnia. And the roses are giving me a last burst of color. I won't deadhead these at this time. I'll let them form some rose hips. These aren't going to be very spectacular rose hips, but it tells the rose it's time to get ready for winter and stop blooming. Some of the other things that provide fall color in the garden would be the sedums. Sedum Autumn Joy is pink at this point. It will be turning a dark rusty red a little later on. And I will be using some of those rusty red blooms, even after they're gone, in some of my winter arrangements. It adds some color and a lot of texture. Over here we have chrysanthemums. I have the chrysanthemums, and these are the ones that came up from last year. You'll remember that we pinched these back several times before July 4th, and so they are not as high as they might have been or as leggy, and they're quite full of bloom. Here's the purple dough master, and this one is more in bloom, and as you can see, a nice dark purple. More of the mums. And we still have the flowering tobacco, which reseeds itself throughout this area of the garden. There are some plants in the garden that went away and are now back, and that would include the poppies. The oriental poppies were completely gone, and the stalks were all cut down, and now we're getting their fall growth. We'll leave that all winter, and it will come up again in the spring, and the poppy will then bloom. The other plants that come up again in the fall are grape hyacinths, and they come up and look a lot like little bits of grass, and they'll come up where the grape hyacinths bloomed last year. In fact, if you're planting new bulbs, it's not a bad idea to put a few grape hyacinths with them, because they'll mark the spot where the bulbs were planted in the fall when it's bulb planting time. Otherwise, you're liable to dig them up when you go to plant new bulbs each fall. I wish I'd done that. I did not realize that I should do that until most recently. But I will start trying to add a few grape hyacinths when I put in my bulbs this year, and that'll come next month. We also have a few cleome blooms and a late blooming clematis that's up on the support. I'm going to move down to the end of the garden as we work our way to the vegetable patch. Happy Returns Daylily has a very good name because it's the only daylily I have that has continued to put blooms up into this season. This is a grass that's turning red as the season goes on. I think it looks pretty nice with this low sedum, which has a pink bloom right now. I've put a few things from one of the flower containers. If you've been watching the show regularly, you've seen that I took apart one of the arrangements that I received earlier in the year as a gift and planted it. Anything that you have planted in the last month, you must be sure to keep watered. They just really need it. I put in several of the plants from the planter in this area, and it's important to keep them watered. If you don't keep them watered now, their chances of making it through the winter are pretty slim. And in fact, anything that you've planted this year during this gardening season needs to go into the fall with an adequate water supply. Hopefully we will have a wet October and have a chance to do some of those things. But at this point, things have been very dry and supplemental watering is needed. Now let's move to the vegetable garden. We're all done planting in the vegetable garden, but it is harvest time. My second planting of spinach, unfortunately because of the drought, hasn't done very well. I've only gotten a few sprigs, but hopefully we'll get a little spinach out of that. However, we have plenty more to pick. I have a winter squash that's ready. I lost some of the vines on these winter squash due to borers. And I did not put the aluminum foil around those stems. Next year I will. I have a few onions that I dug that were left. Most of the onions got used as scallions. And we have garlic here. These are the two garlics. After we harvested the garlic, I left a few pieces. And what I wanted to have were the seeds on top. We got a little garlic on the bottom of these. Not a lot, because we let them go to seed, and that used up some of the food supply in the roots. But what I wanted was this little top piece, and those are garlic seeds. And we will take those and keep them, and we can put those for winter into the garden. We'll plant those in October. The calendulas have done really well. As long as you keep them deadheaded, they'll keep on blooming until they're killed by a very late frost. They'll last through a little bit of frost. The late beans. Late planting of beans has been absolutely wonderful, and most of them are yellow beans. We're getting a lot of yellow beans from this second planting. And a few green beans. I only had a few green bean seeds left, so we only planted a few of those. I have a late planting of lettuce to pick. We have lots of beets, and we'll be picking those to preserve. They'll be fine through a frost. A number of things will be fine during a frost, but some of the things you need to think about picking as soon as you can. The beets can stay in the ground. The parsley will survive for quite a long time in the garden. Again, we'll be picking some of that to preserve it as winter goes on. I have two kinds, both the curled parsley and the Italian parsley. We also have eggplant. And that's one of the tender ones. Remember, we planted it a little later because it is frost prone. Well, it still is. But we can be pick the eggplant and use that. The perpetual spinach just keeps right on. We've had this since, late April or May available to pick. It's kind of a cross between spinach and chard, but it just keeps on going. And you can use it as spinach or chard. Carrots, they're ready to pick too. We can put some of those in. We just have a lot of things to pick at this point. Plenty of kale, and the kale again will stay in the garden practically until it's covered with the snow. On the other hand, the basil and the dill need to be used now, because the first frost you'll come out and the basil plants will be all black, and then it's time to pull them out of the garden. I have parsnips in here. Those will be picked later after a frost. We'll move over this way. I still have cucumbers. We're picking cucumbers regularly out of this bed. And it's been a wonderful crop. I've been able to make pickles and use them for other things in the kitchen. The zucchini, we still have a few. And these 8-ball zucchinis have the habit of turning yellow if you don't pick them right in the fall, and they'll turn orange and look like little pumpkins. So I usually leave a couple on the vine just to turn orange, and then I can use them decoratively as little pumpkins. As we said before, the broccoli and also the piracicaba starting to throw secondary heads. And these are smaller heads of broccoli. So once you've picked the head of broccoli from the center of the plant, don't pull it out. Leave it and get these secondary heads, and you will get quite a lot of broccoli as secondaries. The piracicaba is also forming heads, and it's a broccoli relative that forms smaller heads. I've found that it's very much like the broccolini that you can pay a fortune for at the grocery store and saute. So it makes lovely heads. And the broccoli too will last often into November. We can be picking those secondary heads. And the nice thing is in the late season, you aren't bothered as much by the insects once it's frosted. You can still harvest, but you don't have the insect problems. Successes and problems. You'll remember last time we were plagued with a lot of mildew on the zucchini and summer squash. And I used a milk spray, a combination of about 40% milk and 60% water. And I sprayed some of it. And some of it is looking very nice. The ones that I didn't spray are gone. So that was something that seemed to work, and I will definitely do more of next year because it does seem to be effective. This was a trial to see if it actually worked. I often have problems with borers in the zucchini, and it takes the vines before we've had much of a harvest. That also happens with the winter squash, so I put aluminum foil at the base of the plants. That too seemed to help, and I will continue that practice on all of my squash type vines next year. The flowers that I planted among the vegetables are probably at their fullest bloom. I have some zinnias, some fall asters, that's annual asters, nasturtiums, and a couple of straw flowers that may or may not make it, and also quite a few marigolds, which I like along the edge of the garden. They give a lot of nice color in the fall to this section of the garden, along with the calendulas. I like to mix a few flowers in with the vegetables, just for a little color. The tomato vines, which are in back, are not looking so good. They've gotten dry. And I'm going to work my way back there. We have a few peppers to pick as well, including some that are starting to turn color. We have a Italian frying pepper that started to change color a bit, and tomatoes. And tomatoes will succumb with the first frost, so you want to be sure to pick any that are there. If they're starting to turn yellow and aren't quite ripe, you can bring those in, and they will turn ripe as you bring them in. I have several kinds of tomatoes out here. I have the plum tomatoes, cherry tomatoes, and also some regular round tomatoes. We planted 6 different kinds, as I recall, and all of them have done very well. In fact, we will be working with some of those in the kitchen a little later. I had a few pumpkins that I planted on the fence, and I have some popcorn growing behind my fence, and hopefully we'll have a few kernels to pop come winter. It isn't ready yet. It needs to turn brown and dry. You want it very dry. Unlike sweet corn, which you pick when it's fresh, the popcorn needs to dry right on the stalk. If you've grown hydrangeas in your garden and have them now's the time you can pick them and dry them for fall. Use them just the way they are. Pull the leaves. And sometimes I like to put these into a very shallow glass of water inside and just let the water dry up. And at that point, the flowers will also be dried. And they'll stay green like this all winter. I have these were white when they were in bloom. The ones that are blue when they were in bloom turned pink and kind of a pinkish purple color. And those are very pretty also. But it's time to pick them now. They've started to kind of dry on their own. If you leave them on the bush, they will turn brown, and I've got one here that is working on that, and be this color. And they can also be used that way in dried arrangements, but I kind of like the green ones. Now, on the way back, adding fall color to a shade garden is a little more difficult. We still have lots of green, and these are the latest blooming hosta. And they tend to be a fragrant hosta, and Royal Standard is the name of it. And it's rather plain looking most of the time, but it does have fairly tall white blooms in the fall, if you're looking for something white in the shade garden for fall. Now let's proceed back to the garden shed and spread out our sample from the herb garden to dry. As we go, I need to give my fish a little food in my fish pond. I will not be doing anything with the fish pond just yet. However, as the leaves start to fall, I'll be adding a net. And probably by the next time we meet, there will be a net over the pond. I will also need to take out any of the tender plants, and that would include the elephant ears. I'll try to overwinter them inside. I've had pretty good luck with that by putting them into a container of water. And I'll be pulling those out of the pond within the next week or so. Again, they're tropical plants, which means they really don't like temperatures much under 50 degrees. So we'll be pulling those out so that I can put the net over the pond and possibly trimming some of the other foliage back. I'm feeding the fish today using a fall and winter food. This is more easily digested in cold temperatures. We probably don't need it quite yet, but anytime the temperature of the water drops down, you can start using this fall or spring food when the water is still a little colder than it gets in the summer. Once the water drops below 50 degrees, we'll stop feeding the fish altogether, and they go into kind of a suspended animation in the water where they'll live all winter. But they don't feed much when it's cold. When it's warmer, they'll eat more, and when it's very cold, they don't eat at all. So we'll keep going with the food as long as we can. I'll keep my waterfall going even after I have the net on. We continue to collect seeds from the impatiens, and they continue to add color to the garden. When I do put the net on, I'm careful to leave space. I notice we have a nice frog over there on the rock, and I continue to leave some space so the frogs can get in and out. They need to get out to hunt, and if you fasten it down too tightly around the edges, they can't get in and out and they die. Now I want to go over to this side and show you a couple of other fall blooming plants. This is another fall blooming plant in the shade garden. This shade garden right now is drying up rather badly because usually it would still be fairly lush. However, due to the drought, things are looking a little sad. But this plant is still going strong, and this is Angelica gigas. And it has this reddish bloom in the fall. It sends up this tall spike. And I will leave it and let it go to seed because it is a biennial. It's in the family of the other parsley and some of the other biennials. And so we let it go to seed, and we have on the ground some coming up that will bloom next year. And so these seeds that plant themselves this fall will actually bloom in 2 years. And I have it scattered throughout this area of the shade garden, kind of a little colony of it. It's very interesting, and the bees absolutely love it. I had it covered with honeybees the other day when it was in full bloom. But it adds a very interesting color and texture to the fall garden. We have another couple fall plants over on the other side, and we'll look at those too. This is a plant called Kilone, or turtle head is its common name, and you can see why. If you look at the blooms, they look like a turtle's head with the mouth right here. This comes in white or pink, and it's a shade gardening plant. It also likes moist soil, and it blooms in the fall, which is one of its redeeming characteristics. It's been featured quite a bit in some of the gardening magazines and newspaper articles and online garden articles I've seen lately. It's not as common as many of the other plants, but it is a perennial, and it will come up every year, and it will expand and form a very nice colony. This started out with, I think, just one shoot, and now 3 years later, I have enough to make a showing. But it is something that adds some color to the fall garden. The hostas have all had their blooms removed for neatness, and they will be here until frost. Most of the shade garden does not get deadheaded in the fall, only the hosta, and that when it is completely brown, I will take it out. And you don't really have to do any cutting with it. Once it's completely dried up, it just whips out very easily and can be put in the compost. Coming down here a little further, we have the planter that we did with the oxalis, which actually came along really well. And that's going to be a very tender plant. So what I want to do is lift it out and bring it inside for the winter. It's a house plant, basically, and we're going to use it as such this winter inside. I like the looks of it, and I'm just going to pop it into a pot. I've already put some potting soil in there, so I'm all ready for it. Then we'll water it well, and it'll be ready to bring inside within probably the next week or so. Now let's head on up to the patio. to add this one to the collection I have over here. And these are plants that are ready to come in. And you remember the cuttings we did? Oh, it's been almost a month ago, and I can tug on them a little and realize that they are rooted. And these will be coming inside, and we put 2 or 3 cuttings into each pot. And once they're well rooted, I will remove those so that each pot has 1 cutting. I'll put those on my shelves under my plant lights for the winter, and they are good to go for spring. As they grow, I'll keep pinching out the middle so that they will expand. And actually, you can even in the spring take cuttings from these cuttings and have even more plants to fill your planters. The other plants that are coming in will be some other cuttings that I've taken throughout the season and any plants that I've dug. Remember, we divided these, the Streptocarpus, which is a house plant. Those need to come inside. I now have 2 because I gave the 3rd one away. These other plants will come in, and yes, it looks like a lot. I'm fortunate to have a good-sized sunroom, so I can bring in quite a few plants. Some of them won't make it, and by Christmas, a few of them will meet the compost pile. But I bring in as much as I can. Over here we have a few more. Some we'll leave out. I did want to point out an annual that I like that isn't very common. The salvia is quite common, and the snapdragons are pretty common. But this is Broalia, and it really hits its stride in the late summer and early fall. It is available at the garden centers as tiny plants in the spring, and they really don't do too much until a little later in the year. But it really adds a nice touch of color at this time, and it's one of the things that I found likes this little semi-shaded area very much. And I try to plant it in here almost every year because it is so pretty, and it goes nicely with the dark salvias and also the lighter color snapdragons that I have in this spot. Now let's go inside and do a little cooking. We're going to talk about tomatoes a little bit today. And what we're going to talk about is how to preserve some of them. I've done some canning of tomatoes, and I've also done drying tomatoes this year. Sun-dried tomatoes are quite expensive, and I decided I could dry them in the oven. We don't have enough sun here in New England, dependably, to dry tomatoes, but the oven does a very nice job of it. And what I've done is used some of these larger cherry tomatoes. I grew 2 kinds of cherries, the little ones, which we like to just eat and put in salad, and some that are a little larger, and these happen to dry pretty well. In fact, in the write-up for the seeds, they mentioned that this one was good for drying. And I thought, oh, that sounds good. So we've grown several plants of these, and what I'm basically doing is just, after I washed them and dried them, I'm cutting them in half, and I put them on a silicone mat, a Silpat mat or such. It's a mat that you can put in your baking sheet and it won't stick, and it goes into the oven. And that's pretty much all there is to it if you want to just dry some. And I'm putting these in a 250-degree oven, and we'll just leave them in there for several hours until they get very much dried. And they will be all crinkled up and dried and look just like the dried tomatoes that you buy. After that, I'll put them into a freezer bag, store them in the freezer, and when I'm ready to use them, I'll let them thaw in a little olive oil. And voila, I have oiled dried tomatoes very quickly to put in sauces and soups all winter. The other thing you can do with them is to roast them, and for that I've used the plum tomatoes, and I've seeded those, and I'm going to cut up a little garlic on these. And once you've got these roasted, and they aren't going to cook as long, they're just going to roast a little bit. And this cut up garlic will also roast. And I'll sprinkle these with a little bit of olive oil. And I don't have 2 mats, so I'm using parchment paper on this pan, and it works just as well. You can also dry them on parchment, but you do need something so that they won't. And I'm going to add a little thyme, and this is some of the thyme I picked and dried from the garden earlier in the season. And I'll add that. And when these are done, again, I can freeze them and then get them out to use in sauces, pasta dishes, any number of things, and they're already seasoned. And I'll be putting those into the same oven, or I can put them into a slightly warmer oven, say 350. I actually have some that I did yesterday, and I'm going to use those to make a tomato tart. And you can see they've all dried up, and there's the garlic and olive oil. Now, one thing I did with these that's a little different, you'll notice I put them flat side down, and after they've dried for about, half an hour or so at 350, you can take them out and pull the skins right off. And then you have them without their skins if you don't like the skins. But I've also par-baked a crust, a tart crust, and I'm going to add a mixture on the base. And the recipe that I had called for creme fraiche, which I don't have and don't keep in the refrigerator regularly. So I used an ounce of cream cheese and a tablespoon of yogurt, Greek yogurt. Those are two things I do often have in the refrigerator. And I'm going to spread these over the tart shell. Also, in that mixture is a tablespoon of brown mustard. And then sprinkle that with some Gruyere cheese. Jarlsberg also works well. And then I'll take these tomatoes, which are right now on the parchment. It should come up easily. And we'll add these to the top of the tart. We should have enough. Incidentally, this was 3 pounds of tomatoes that I roasted yesterday. And looks like it really cooked them down. So if you're trying to save space in your freezer, this is one way to do it. You can also freeze whole tomatoes in the freezer. They do take up a lot of space. And if I want to do whole tomatoes, I tend to do canning. I'm going to put this in along with the garlic. I'm going to put this in a 350 oven for about 25 minutes. And then we'll move on to something else. I've been sauteing some garlic in this pan, and some of it actually got a little too brown. We will take that out. And I want to add some ground beef to this. We're going to make a chicken soup. Forgot I turned it on. This is Italian wedding soup, which is a popular soup, and it's a really nice thing to have in your freezer. If you're out there raking leaves and doing other fall tasks, it's real nice to have a nice soup to come home and come into the kitchen with. And my spatula. I'm going to just let this brown. I do have some garlic in here. You can also use garlic powder. And I want to add some of the oregano that we dried earlier, just to give it some seasoning. So we'll have some garlic and oregano flavor. as that browns in the pan. And while that's browning, I also cooked up some chicken breasts yesterday to use, and the water that I canned it in, I then boiled down and to concentrate it a little bit to make some of the chicken broth for the soup. And I'm going to add that to the soup kettle. And I'll put that on the back burner and start heating it. And we're going to add more chicken broth. The whole recipe will take probably close to 3 quarts. Makes quite a lot of soup. That started boiling. And I need to get out some carrots, which I've already cut. We cut the carrots, I picked some of those again yesterday and sliced them up, and we'll put those in and start them cooking. And continue browning up the beef. It's cutting pretty well. We can stop that for a few minutes and pour out a little more of the chicken broth. We've put 2 quarts in. That'll make 84 ounces of chicken broth that we've used. While we're waiting for the soup to boil a little bit, we're going to do a little bit with parsley and preserving that. We've talked about this in the past a little bit, but I'm repeating it because it's helpful. And one of the ways that you can keep parsley in the refrigerator is to just put it into a glass jar. Not a plastic jar, not a plastic bag. This has been washed and trimmed, and it still has a little bit of dampness. I did run it through the salad spinner, but it's still a bit damp. And you just put that into the plastic jar. You don't add water. And it needs to be a glass jar. That's the important part. You don't want plastic with it. And then you just seal it up and keep it in the refrigerator. And you can use from that jar for several months. It really takes a long time. The other way to do parsley is to make what's called a parsley roll for the freezer. And this would be used in soups and other cooked dishes, whereas that can be used fresh out of the refrigerator, but it won't last forever. This will last all winter. And you basically pack it as tightly as you can into the bottom of a plastic bag. Freezer bag is good. And then you roll it up as tight as you can. Push it down in there. We really want it very tight. And get all the air out. And there's a spot to label it, and I would write parsley on it, and fasten it with a couple rubber bands and put it in the freezer. Then when you want to use parsley, you can remove it from the bag and slice off a piece to put into your soup or stew. And we did this also with cilantro, and it works very well to have some available during the winter months. There have been so many incidences of these herbs with recalls, and having your own is always nice to have them available. Now let's see, I think we can start adding things to the soup. We're going to let it cook for a while anyway. And I'm going to add the beef. Try to leave the fat in the pan. I do use ground beef, lean beef. I'll add about 3 chicken breasts, which have been cooked and cut up. And 1 cup of acini di pepe, which is a soup pasta, and it looks like little grains of rice, very small, tiny grains of rice. And we'll add that into our soup. And I'm going to move that up to this burner so that it cooks a little faster. And give it a good stir. And this can, the times vary. You need to cook it at least a half an hour and probably more. We'll also add the rest of the chicken broth. Makes a good sized pot of soup. You should have some for supper and then some to freeze for another meal. We have a few more things to add, but we won't do that yet. Instead, we're going to do some canning. And I've done some canning of tomato products. Canning is not difficult as long as you follow the directions. I've done tomato sauce, I've done whole tomatoes, and I've made chili sauce. And as long as you follow reputable directions, you're all set. Things have changed since your grandmother canned. And if you have the opportunity to pick up one of these things called a blue book, if you want to do canning, it's a good idea to get a new one every couple of years because the techniques do change somewhat over time. And you do want to be safe as you can things. But we're going to start by making a brine and make some pickled beans today. One and a quarter cups of water and the same amount of vinegar, 1 1/4 cups. I'm only going to make a couple pints. If you're anxious about canning, making things that are pickled, that include vinegar and salt, is a pretty sure and safe way to go. I'm using pickling salt. Add the vinegar. We're going to bring this to a boil on the back burner. Stir the soup once more. It's starting to cook. The canning jars have been run through the dishwasher, and the lids and rings have been washed in soapy water and put in warm water. They used to say that you needed to pour boiling water over them or bring them to a simmer, but that is one of the new pieces of information. You don't need to do that anymore. All you need to do is put them into water. I do have some boiling water in the canning kettle. This is a canning kettle. And I am going to turn that on, I hope. And this is called water bath canning. As long as you're canning fruits and high acid vegetables like tomatoes, and of course anything with pickling syrup in it, like pickles and pickled beans, pickled beets, any of the pickles. You can use a water bath canner, and a water bath canner is a large container to hold water, and it has a rack. And you might have a spaghetti cooker that would work, that as long as it has an insert that you can lift the jars out. A water bath canner works by immersing the cans in boiling water and exhausting the air until they seal. If you want to can plain green beans or other vegetables that are not as acidic, then you need a pressure canner which pulls pressure. I used to do pressure canning, I no longer do it. Beans and corn require pressure canning. As long as you know which things require it and which don't, you're fine with the water bath canner. Today we're going to do some pickled yellow beans because I have yellow beans in abundance. And I'm going to be packing these beans into a couple jars. And we'll pack them in fairly tight. And I don't want any that hang out. If they do, I'll need to cut them off. You want to keep them below the level of the top, and if you need to, you can always cut a little off or cut them. You have a knife here someplace, or just break them off. Some of the smaller ones. Again, these have been picked. The ends have been taken off and they have been washed well. The cans have been run through the dishwasher. Again, older recipes will tell you to sterilize them for 20 minutes. But if you have a dishwasher that can take care of that task for you, that's fine to do as long as you're going to be putting them in the canner. Old recipes for almost anything that doesn't require canning should not be used. Even jams and jellies, rather than putting on the paraffin and things like that, are just not considered safe and dependable. If you follow good instructions, you'll have pretty much no loss at all. Just going to do a couple of these in the canner. Again, we want to leave a 1/2 inch headroom on these. Headroom is the amount between the top of the jar and the produce that's in it. You can fit a few more beans in. These are a nice condiment, relish tray type thing. And they will be a little peppy, a little hot. Okay, we have our cans filled. Now we need to add our pickling solution, and also I want to get some of the boiling water or hot water out of the canner and put it into a pan. I also want to dip this cloth, it's a clean cloth, in so I can wipe the jars as I get them ready. One at a time. This is a very handy canning utensil. It's a funnel with a wide mouth. We've boiled our brine. Oh, forgot one thing. We need to add some things. They can't be dilled green beans unless we add some dill. And you can either add green dill to the jars or the dried dill. I'll add a sprig of each to each of the jars. I'll also add a clove of garlic to each jar. And about 1/8 to 1/4 teaspoon of cayenne pepper. This is what gives it the heat. Now they're ready to add the brine. I'll bring this up until it's about a 1/2 inch from the top. We pop one of the lids on. These lids are not reusable. Once you're done with them, you're done, but you can use the rings again. I tightened them just slightly. This can's hot. And then you pick it up and put it on the rack in the canner. We're going to repeat that again with our next can. And I'm out of brine. Therefore, I need to make a little more. Again, I'll use the 1 1/4 water. We'll turn our burner back on. We just need to dissolve it well. 2 tablespoons of salt. We're actually repeating this so that I think this is pretty much ready. Again, we just needed a bit more. And again, we want to wipe off the top of the container where the jar will go. It has an adhesive on it that will fasten to the jar as it's processed. Once you have all of the jars into the canner, this one will hold about 7 or 8 jars, depending on the size. It will hold quarts or pints and half pints, but it depends which size they are, how many fit. Then I'll lower this into the boiling water, or soon to be boiling water, and put on the lid. You don't start counting time on this until it's at a full rolling boil. And you want to make sure that the water covers each jar, whether they're quarts or pints or half pints, by 1 inch to 2 inches. And we'll just let it boil at this point. And we want it at a full boil. And that's and then once we have boiled these for 10 minutes, we can take them out and we'll set them on a dry dish towel next to the canner and let them cool for 24 hours before we move them. That will ensure that the seal sets. At that point, you can put them in, label them and put them away and use them when the snow starts flying. We have a few more things to add to our soup now that it's boiling, and I think our carrots are getting almost finished. I'm going to add spinach, and this is spinach that I've cut up and cooked, and you can use 2 packages of frozen spinach. This looks like a lot of spinach, but you're going to see this spinach melt right into the soup. So it takes quite a bit to make up for 2 packages of frozen spinach. We'll stir that around, and you could probably use kale. I find kale has a little stronger flavor. I like the spinach. And frozen spinach works just as well as fresh. But I have fresh right now, so I'll be using that. You may need to add more chicken broth later on as the pasta, if you put it in the refrigerator or freezer, the pasta continues to swell in the chicken broth. It's time to get that tart out of the oven. And let that cool. And it's soaked into our crust a little bit, and the crust is browned. Again, with the spinach, you can add as much as you wish. It's cooked down quite a lot. I think you can see I put in several large handfuls. I could probably even put in a little more, and I think I will. I have a lot of spinach. And another handful. My canner has an indicator on the top that tells you when it is fully boiling inside, which is very handy. So when it reaches that point, I can start timing it. The next thing I want to add to the soup is 2 beaten eggs. And this is, I'll just add it in a stream and it will cook as I put it in. I can stir it a little as I add it. But that's one of the features of the Italian wedding soup. It's really quite full of protein for a soup. You have beef and chicken and egg and spinach. And at the last, we'll add 4 ounces of cheese, grated Parmesan cheese, and stir that in. There are probably as many recipes for this as there are Italian grandmothers. And there we have it. We'll let it cook a few more minutes. I did want to show you the dried tomatoes. They won't be ready for our show, but these are the dried tomatoes. Some that I dried earlier, and they were the same size starting out as the tomatoes that we had on the baking sheet. They're not completely dry, which is why I like to store them in the freezer. They are not shelf stable, but they do work quite well in the freezer. And then I can add olive oil to them when I want to use them. The roast tomatoes, the same way. You can freeze those. I put these on the tart and with the cheese and mustard under them, and we can serve that. Also some things that are in season, and we'll pour out a bowl of soup in a minute. We have apples and apple pie. This is an apple and pear pie. Pears are in season too, and there's some really lovely fruit available locally. And I also made some apple muffins, and we'll pour out a nice bowl of soup. And you can see what it looks like in the bowl. And there we have Italian wedding soup, tomato tart, muffins, apple pie. I've been busy canning and preserving some of the things from the garden. This will continue as long as the garden lasts, and then we'll start using those and cooking some other things. Thank you for joining me today for a walk in the garden. I'm Liz Davey. This is NCTV, Norfolk Cable Television. And I look forward to seeing you next time for a walk in the garden.